What the world witnessed over the past 72 hours has virtually no parallel in the modern history of Middle Eastern conflict, and very little precedent in the broader history of 21st century warfare. This was not an air battle. This was not a missile exchange. This was not the kind of confrontation that military analysts had spent years wargaming in think tanks and classified briefing rooms. What happened was something that military theorists have written about for decades as a theoretical possibility, but that most Western defense establishments privately believed would never materialize in this theater against these adversaries on this timeline. Iran reached up and took out Israel's eyes. Not metaphorically, not partially, completely. In a coordinated, multi-domain operation that combined electronic warfare, directed energy systems, and cyber intrusion, at a scale and a level of sophistication that left American intelligence analysts actively revising their assessments in real time, Iran systematically dismantled the satellite architecture that Israel's entire modern military depends upon. We are talking about targeting data, navigation systems, encrypted communications, situational awareness across every layer of the battlefield. All of it gone. And when those satellites went dark, when the data feeds that Israeli F-35 pilots rely on for mission execution stopped updating, when the targeting systems that give Israeli air power its decisive edge over every regional adversary were suddenly operating on degraded or completely absent information, the most advanced fighter aircraft on the face of this earth became extraordinarily expensive machines flying through a fog that their designers never anticipated they would have to navigate. The F-35 Adir, Israel's crown jewel, the aircraft that the Israeli Air Force has built its entire doctrine of regional air superiority around, requires a continuous, uninterrupted flow of data from multiple satellite constellations to function at the level its operational concept demands. Sensor fusion, the process by which the aircraft integrates radar data, infrared data, electronic intelligence, and external data feeds into a single coherent battlespace picture, depends on that data flow the way a human brain depends on blood. Cut the flow, and the brain still operates, but not at the level that makes it dangerous. Without satellite connectivity, the F-35 can still fly. What it cannot do is execute the kind of networked, beyond visual range, sensor-fused combat operations that make it the most dominant aircraft in the world. Stripped of its data architecture, it becomes a very expensive fourth-generation aircraft. That is precisely what Iran engineered and delivered, and the consequences cascaded through the entire Israeli Air Force in ways that the morning after made absolutely impossible to deny. Today's analysis goes deep into every single dimension of this operation. We will examine the full technical architecture of Iran's denial campaign and why it succeeded against systems that were specifically designed to be resilient against exactly this kind of attack. We will break down what the F-35's loss of satellite connectivity actually means in operational terms, and why the Israeli Air Force found itself unable to execute the very missions its entire strategic position depends upon. We will analyze the broader collapse of Israeli air capability that followed, and trace the American shock response that revealed just how completely unprepared Washington was for an adversary operating at this level. And we will examine what this night means, not just for the immediate conflict, but for the future of the regional order it is now reshaping. Before we go any further, this is US Power Analytics. If this channel is delivering the depth of analysis you simply cannot find anywhere else, hit like, subscribe, and drop your perspective in the comments below. This story is still unfolding. Your engagement keeps this analysis sharp, independent, and going. Now, to truly understand the scale of what just happened, you need to understand something fundamental about how the Israeli military was built. Israel's dependence on satellite architecture is not a weakness that developed by accident. It is the direct consequence of a deliberate strategic choice, a choice made across decades of defense investment, the choice to build a military whose decisive advantages are rooted in information superiority rather than numerical mass. Israel cannot match its adversaries in population. It cannot match them in the sheer volume of military hardware those populations can field. What it can do, what it has invested enormous resources into being able to do, is no more, process faster, and act with greater precision than any adversary it faces. And that information superiority depends on satellites in a way that is structural, not optional. not easily worked around. The satellites that Israel operates and relies upon, a combination of indigenous reconnaissance platforms, communication relay systems, and navigation augmentation assets, supplemented by access to American constellation assets under bilateral agreements, perform functions that span the entire spectrum of military operations. Reconnaissance satellites provide targeting data for strike planning. Communication satellites relay encrypted command traffic between command nodes and deployed units. Navigation augmentation systems provide the precision positioning that guided munitions, networked combat operations, and precision strikes all require. Electronic intelligence satellites monitor adversary communications and radar emissions across the region. Remove any one of these functions, and Israeli military capability degrades. Remove all of them simultaneously, and the degradation is not additive. It is multiplicative. This is exactly what Iran targeted. Not a single satellite, not a single constellation. The entire architecture, simultaneously, through a combination of methods that revealed a level of investment in counter-space capability that Western assessments had completely failed to capture. The first component of the Iranian operation was electronic. A combination of high-powered jamming directed against the uplink frequencies used to command and communicate with Israeli satellite assets and against the downlink frequencies through which those satellites transmit their data to ground stations and to user terminals aboard aircraft and at command facilities. Jamming satellite communications is not a new concept. What was entirely new was the power levels and the frequency coverage that Iranian systems brought to bear. Power levels that exceeded what Western assessments had projected as Iran's current electronic warfare ceiling by a significant margin. And the jamming was not conducted from a single location. It was conducted simultaneously from multiple geographically dispersed positions that had been selected and carefully prepared in advance to ensure that the jamming coverage overlapped across all relevant satellite geometries. The effect was devastating. Israeli ground stations receiving satellite data found their signals degraded to completely unusable quality across multiple constellations simultaneously. The redundancy that the Israeli system had been designed with, the ability to lose one satellite link and immediately reroute through an alternative, was overwhelmed because the attack targeted every single alternative at the exact same time. There was no fallback. There was no reroute. There was nothing. The second component was cyber. And this one is where things get deeply uncomfortable. A sophisticated intrusion campaign targeting the ground segment infrastructure through which satellite systems are controlled and through which their data is processed and distributed to end users, including F-35 mission systems. The cyber component had clearly been in preparation for an extended period of time. The intrusions that activated during the operation showed a level of familiarity with the specific software architectures and network configurations of Israeli satellite ground segment facilities that simply cannot be acquired quickly. This was the product of months, possibly years, of quiet, patient pre-positioning, establishing persistent access to systems that would be activated at the operationally chosen moment. But here's the part that makes this particularly dangerous. When the cyber component activated, it did not simply disrupt the data flow. It injected corrupted data into the processing pipelines that distribute satellite information to military users, including directly into F-35 mission systems. And the corrupted data was carefully, deliberately designed to be plausible enough that automated systems would not immediately flag it as invalid, but wrong enough that the tactical pictures being generated from it were completely operationally unreliable. This is a fundamentally more sophisticated and far more dangerous form of attack than simple denial. Denial tells the user that the system is not working. The user knows something is wrong. The user stops relying on it. Data corruption tells the user that the system is working when it is not. The user keeps relying on it. Decisions get made on false information rather than on a recognized absence of information. That distinction is the difference between a pilot who knows he's flying blind and a pilot who thinks he can see when he cannot. The third component involved directed energy, the use of high-powered laser systems to dazzle or outright damage the optical sensors aboard Israeli reconnaissance satellites as they passed over Iranian territory and the broader engagement zone. Dazzling, temporarily overwhelming a sensor with an intense burst of light, is a reversible effect. It temporarily blinds the satellite's ability to collect imagery without permanently destroying the hardware. Damage goes further. It can permanently degrade sensor capability in ways that cannot be reversed without physically replacing the satellite. The full extent to which Iranian directed energy operations achieve temporary dazzle versus actual permanent damage to Israeli satellite sensors will take time to completely assess. But the operational effect during the critical engagement window was identical either way. The reconnaissance satellites that Israeli strike planners depend on for real-time targeting data were not providing reliable imagery product during the hours that mattered most. 3 layers: electronic jamming, cyber intrusion with data corruption, directed energy against optical sensors, operating simultaneously, covering every angle of attack, leaving no redundancy intact. The satellite architecture that Israel's military depends on was simultaneously unable to communicate reliably, providing corrupted data where it was communicating at all, and unable to collect reliable imagery for the military users depending on it. The effect was total. The eyes went dark. To fully understand what happened to the Israeli F-35 fleet when satellite connectivity was degraded, you need to understand what the F-35 actually is at its operational core, because most people get this wrong. The F-35 is not primarily a fighter aircraft in the traditional sense, a fast maneuverable platform optimized for close-range dogfighting. That is not what it was designed to be. That is not where its military value comes from. The F-35 is a flying sensor and data processing node, a platform whose entire military value, whose entire reason for existing, comes from its ability to fuse enormous quantities of information from multiple sources into a single coherent battle space picture. A picture that gives the pilot and the broader network around that pilot a level of situational awareness that no previous aircraft in the history of aviation has ever provided. The F-35 Adir variant that Israel operates has been customized with Israeli-developed avionics and electronic warfare systems that push its capabilities beyond the baseline American configuration. But it retains the fundamental character of the original F-35 design. A platform that is extraordinarily, almost incomprehensibly capable when its information architecture is fully intact, and that degrades in ways that are not immediately obvious from the outside when that architecture is compromised. And that degradation, that is exactly what Iran engineered. The sensor fusion that makes the F-35 dangerous operates on a clear hierarchy of data sources. The aircraft's own onboard sensors generate the primary layer of data. Its AESA radar, its distributed aperture system, the 6 infrared cameras mounted around the airframe that provide the pilot with a full 360-degree awareness of everything happening around the aircraft in every direction simultaneously. Its electronic intelligence receivers that passively monitor radar emissions and communications across the electromagnetic spectrum. These onboard sensors are genuinely capable, world-class, among the best ever installed on a combat aircraft. But that primary data, as capable as it is, and is enriched and contextualized by a second layer, data received from external sources through the aircraft's communication systems, data from other aircraft in the formation, data from ground stations, and critically, data from satellite assets that provide targeting information, navigation precision, and the broader operational picture that situates the aircraft's local sensor picture within the larger engagement environment. When satellite connectivity degrades, that entire enrichment layer disappears. The aircraft is left with its own sensors only. And those sensors, genuinely capable as they are, cannot, without the contextual data that the external network provides, generate the kind of integrated situational awareness that the F-35's entire operational concept depends upon. Beyond visual range targeting, engaging threats that the pilot cannot directly see or independently track with onboard sensors alone becomes unreliable when the data enabling it is absent, or worse, corrupted. For the Israeli Air Force, which has built its entire concept of operations around the F-35's ability to conduct networked, beyond visual range operations in heavily contested airspace, the degradation of satellite connectivity was not a manageable inconvenience. It was the removal of the operational foundation that the force's entire doctrine rests on. The missions that Israeli F-35 squadrons had been tasked to execute in this operational cycle were not simple missions. deep strike operations against Iranian infrastructure targets, suppression of enemy air defense operations in support of other strike packages moving through contested airspace, air superiority patrols designed to prevent Iranian and Hezbollah air assets from operating freely across the theater. Every single one of these missions depended on the satellite-enabled data architecture that the Iranian operation had just systematically dismantled. When pilots began their pre-mission checks and found that the data feeds that should be populating their mission systems with current targeting and threat information were either completely absent or flagging active data integrity warnings, the missions did not simply proceed with reduced capability, they were suspended. The strike packages that had been planned and prepared for execution in the hours following the satellite denial operation were stood down entirely while ground crews and intelligence officers attempted to assess the full scope of the problem and develop workable alternatives. The alternatives that were available were inadequate. The Israeli Air Force has contingency procedures for operating in degraded satellite environments. Procedures developed precisely because every sophisticated military in the world acknowledges the theoretical vulnerability of satellite dependence. These procedures exist. They have been trained against. They are real. But those procedures were developed against a very specific assumption: partial satellite degradation, losing one constellation while others remain available, experiencing jamming in a limited geographic area while maintaining connectivity elsewhere, scenarios where the system is wounded but still breathing. They were not developed for the scenario that was actually unfolding: comprehensive, simultaneous degradation across every satellite architecture through multiple attack methods, all at once, with no intact fallback remaining. And here is where the situation became worse than simply having no data at all. Attempting to execute precision strike operations with corrupted targeting data is not just ineffective, it is actively dangerous. Aircraft that launched against targets based on corrupted coordinate data were not striking their intended objectives. The precision that is the entire justification, the entire strategic and moral rationale for the risk and cost of F-35 operations, the ability to strike exactly the right point, exactly the right target with minimal collateral exposure, was gone. Strikes executed under these conditions were generating not precision results, but uncertainty. And in a conflict environment where the distinction between a legitimate military target and civilian infrastructure can be measured in meters, uncertainty in targeting is not just operationally unacceptable. It is strategically catastrophic. Squadron commanders who understood what was happening began grounding their aircraft rather than launching missions that could not be executed with any reliable degree of precision or confidence. That was the correct tactical decision, the only responsible decision available to them under those circumstances. It was also, and this is the part that matters most strategically, exactly the decision that Iran's operation had been designed from the beginning to produce. Not the destruction of Israeli aircraft in air-to-air combat. Iran never needed to shoot a single F-35 out of the sky. What Iran needed, and what Iran achieved, was the self-grounding of the Israeli Air Force through the systematic degradation of the information architecture its operations fundamentally depend on. The flight lines at Israeli Air Force bases that would normally have been alive with the constant roar of sortie generation, aircraft launching, recovering, being turned around and launched again in continuous cycles, fell quiet. The aircraft were there, sitting on the ramp, ready. The pilots were there, suited up, briefed. The maintenance crews were there, the fuel was there, the weapons were loaded. Every single physical element required to generate air power was present and accounted for, except the one thing, the only thing, that transformed that collection of hardware and trained personnel into a coherent, networked, precision strike force capable of deciding the outcome of a regional conflict. The satellite-enabled information architecture that made all of it effective. Without it, the most advanced air force in the Middle East sat on the ground. Not because it was destroyed, not because it was defeated in combat, because the invisible foundation it stood on had been pulled out from underneath it. The grounding of the F-35 strike packages was the most visible symptom of what was happening. But it was only the beginning of a far broader, far deeper collapse that spread through the entire Israeli Air Force structure as the full scope of the satellite denial operation became apparent to commanders on the ground. Because here's what most people are missing when they talk about this story. The F-35 is the tip of the Israeli Air Force spear. It is the most capable, most advanced, most consequential asset in the inventory. But it is not the only element of Israeli air power that depends on satellite connectivity. And the degradation of satellite architecture did not confine its effects to the fleet's most advanced aircraft, not even close. The F-15I RAAM and F-16I Sufa squadrons, the aircraft that form the numerical backbone of Israeli air combat capability, the workhorses that have carried the operational load of Israeli air power for decades, also rely on satellite-derived data for navigation precision, for the targeting systems aboard their precision-guided munitions, for the communication networks through which they coordinate with command, with each other, and with the intelligence feeds that update their threat pictures in near real time. These aircraft are more capable of operating in a degraded satellite environment than the F-35. Their operational concepts were developed in an earlier era, an era when satellite dependence was less absolute, when pilots were trained to operate with less data and still get results. But they too experienced significant capability degradation when the satellite architecture collapsed. And the reason comes down to one thing: munitions. The precision-guided munitions that make up the overwhelming majority of the guided weapons in Israeli Air Force inventory, munitions whose terminal guidance depends on GPS to find their targets, became operationally unreliable the moment the navigation signal was being jammed or corrupted. Weapons that had been certified and employed successfully for years, weapons that Israeli aircrew had trained with, trusted, and built their entire strike doctrine around, could no longer be trusted to deliver the precision their employment parameters assumed. The option of switching to inertially guided delivery, bombing without GPS correction, relying purely on the aircraft's internal navigation system to get the weapon to the target, was technically available. But exercising that option meant restoring Israeli air attack capability to a level of precision that belonged to a previous generation of warfare, not to the precision strike paradigm that Israeli air doctrine has been built around for the past 2 decades. The gap between where Israeli air power needed to be and where it suddenly found itself was not a small gap. It was a chasm, and then, as if the grounding of strike aircraft and the degradation of precision munitions wasn't enough, the Air Defense Coordination Network began to break down as well. The system that integrates airborne radar platforms with ground-based sensors and with command and control infrastructure to manage the overall air picture, the system that is supposed to give Israeli commanders a real-time, continuously updated, comprehensive view of everything moving through the airspace, was experiencing the exact same satellite connectivity degradation as the strike aircraft. The ability to maintain a coherent, real-time air picture, one that covers all relevant airspace, updates continuously as the tactical situation evolves, and provides reliable identification data for every contact in the picture, depends on communication links that the Iranian operation had systematically degraded. What commanders were left with was a picture that was hours old in some sectors, self-contradicting in others, where corrupted data had been injected into the processing pipelines, and simply absent in zones where jamming had completely severed the relevant communication links. This is a point that deserves specific attention, because it is not immediately intuitive. Operating air defense with a degraded and partially corrupted picture is not simply less effective than operating with a complete, reliable picture. It is actively dangerous in ways that compound the original problem and create entirely new ones. When an aircraft cannot be positively identified because the identification data link carrying the IFF signal is not functioning reliably, the commander faces an impossible choice: engage the contact as potentially hostile and risk destroying a friendly aircraft. Fratricide, the kind of mistake that breaks units and ends careers and haunts everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Or do not engage and risk allowing a genuinely hostile aircraft or missile to pass through unchallenged. Neither option is acceptable. But when the identification architecture is degraded, those are the only options available. And it gets worse. Threat aircraft operating in the gaps of the degraded picture coverage, in the zones where jamming has created blind spots in the sensor network, are not being tracked. Aircraft and missiles that are not being tracked are not being engaged. They are moving freely through airspace that is supposed to be controlled and protected. The coherent, layered, deeply integrated air defense architecture that Israel has spent decades and enormous resources building, the system that is supposed to make Israeli airspace essentially impenetrable to hostile aircraft and missiles, was functioning in this moment not as an integrated network. It was functioning as a collection of locally aware but poorly coordinated individual systems, each one doing its best with the information it had, but unable to share that information effectively with the nodes around it. Iranian air assets operating in this degraded environment, drones, cruise missiles, other platforms, were not flying random routes and hoping for the best. They were flying with a precision that made something unmistakably clear to every analyst watching the operation unfold in real time. The routes these assets flew skirted the coverage zones of sensors that were still providing reliable data. The timing exploited the coordination latency that the degraded network was experiencing, launching assets into windows where the handoff between sensor coverage zones was slowest and most uncertain. The Iranian operation demonstrated a level of knowledge about Israeli air defense architecture, about the specific locations of sensors, about the specific frequencies and protocols of the communication links tying them together, about the specific gaps that would open up when those links were degraded, that went far beyond what can be inferred from outside observation. This was not educated guesswork. This was not analysis from open sources. This was inside knowledge, the product of years of patient intelligence collection against one of the most security-conscious military establishments on Earth. Step back and look at what the complete operational picture looked like by this point. F-35 strike aircraft, grounded or operating so far below effective capability that the distinction barely matters. F-15I and F-16I strike packages, executing missions with degraded precision munitions, operating at a level of effectiveness belonging to a previous era of warfare. Precision-guided munitions across the entire inventory, unreliable, untrusted, potentially dangerous to employ. Air defense picture, fragmented, partially corrupted, creating coordination gaps that hostile assets were actively and successfully exploiting. The result of this comprehensive, simultaneous, multi-layer degradation was the effective collapse of Israeli air superiority over a conflict theater where Israeli air superiority had been assumed by Israel, by its allies, by its adversaries, by every analyst covering the region, and to be permanent and essentially unchallengeable. Not a temporary setback that would be recovered within hours through technical workarounds and determination. A fundamental operational failure, one that exposed with brutal clarity how fragile the information architecture underlying Israeli air dominance actually was when subjected to a comprehensive, multi-method, simultaneous attack by an adversary that had spent years understanding exactly how to break it. For a military whose entire strategic concept, the concept that allows a small nation surrounded by adversaries to maintain its security and its existence, rests on the ability of its air force to be decisive, to project power, to deter and, if necessary, destroy threats before they can overwhelm a force that cannot match its adversaries in numbers, this was not simply a bad night. This was an existential strategic challenge. The removal, even temporarily, of the capability that makes Israel's entire defense model viable. The demonstration that the foundation on which decades of Israeli security has been built is not as solid as it appeared. That is not a tactical problem to be solved with better equipment or updated procedures. That is a strategic reckoning of the most serious kind. The shock in Washington was genuine, it was deep, and it reverberated through every layer of the American national security establishment in ways that are still being processed. But here is the critical distinction that needs to be made clearly, because it changes everything about how this failure is understood. The shock in Washington was not the shock of a government watching a surprise attack on its ally unfold without any prior warning whatsoever. American intelligence had visibility on Iranian electronic warfare development programs. American analysts had tracked Iranian investments in satellite denial capability for years. American cyber teams had observed Iranian intrusion attempts against satellite ground segment infrastructure, had flagged them, documented them, and attributed several of them to Iranian state actors with high confidence. The raw intelligence components of what Iran executed last night, the individual pieces of the puzzle, were known, at least partially, to American intelligence before the operation occurred. The shock was something fundamentally more unsettling than simple surprise. It was the shock of recognition. The specific, deeply uncomfortable moment when an intelligence community that had formally assessed Iranian satellite denial capability as developmental, as not yet operationally significant, as years away from the threshold required for comprehensive employment against a sophisticated adversary, watched that exact capability deployed at an operational scale and sophistication that its own assessments had explicitly said was not yet possible. This was not a failure to collect intelligence. This was a failure to correctly interpret intelligence that had already been collected. A failure to accurately assess what the collected information actually meant about Iranian capability. A failure of analysis, which in many ways is a more serious and more difficult problem to fix than a failure of collection. The National Reconnaissance Office, the agency responsible for American satellite operations and for assessing threats to satellite systems worldwide, had been monitoring Iranian counterspace capability development for years. Its assessments had consistently placed Iranian satellite jamming capability below the threshold that could achieve comprehensive denial against the Israeli satellite architecture. Those assessments were based on power-level estimates derived from observed Iranian electronic warfare facilities, on frequency coverage assessments built from signals intelligence collection, on the number and geographic positioning of Iranian electronic warfare installations that American collection assets could observe and characterize. By every metric that American intelligence was measuring, Iranian capability fell short of the threshold required to do what Iran just did. What those assessments fundamentally failed to account for was a possibility that, in retrospect, should have been given far greater weight. The possibility that Iranian counterspace capability was being deliberately, systematically concealed, that the facilities and systems that American collection was observing and measuring, the installations that formed the empirical basis of every capability assessment produced over the past several years, represented not the totality of Iranian capability, but a carefully managed fraction of it. Of a fraction specifically sized and configured to present an observable signature that would lead American analysts to conclude that Iranian capability remained below the operationally significant threshold. If that is what happened, and the operational results of last night suggest strongly that it is, then the assessments derived from those observable indicators were not just slightly off. They were systematically, structurally wrong by a margin large enough to produce exactly the kind of operational surprise that just occurred. The cyber dimension of the intelligence failure is even more uncomfortable to examine. Because in this case, the warning signs were not subtle. American cyber intelligence had detected Iranian intrusion attempts against Israeli satellite ground segment infrastructure. These were not minor, ambiguous indicators. They were the kind of network reconnaissance activity, methodical, patient, targeted against specific systems, that typically precedes an offensive cyber operation. The intrusions had been flagged. They had been assessed. In several cases, they had been formally attributed to Iranian state actors with a reasonable degree of confidence. But the assessment of their significance, the analytical judgment about what those intrusions actually meant, and what they were actually preparing for, concluded that while Iran was clearly interested in Israeli satellite infrastructure, the activity represented intelligence collection rather than pre-positioning for offensive action. That assessment was wrong, catastrophically wrong. The intrusions were both things simultaneously. They were intelligence collection, gathering detailed knowledge of the specific software architectures, network configurations, and operational procedures of Israeli satellite ground segment facilities. And they were also offensive pre-positioning, establishing the persistent access that would be activated months later at the operationally chosen moment. The analytical failure was not in detecting the activity. The activity was detected. The failure was in understanding its full purpose, in recognizing that what looked primarily like espionage was simultaneously laying the groundwork for sabotage. Within the NSC emergency session that convened as the scope of the satellite denial operation became fully apparent, as the intelligence community began to grasp the full dimensions of what Iran had just accomplished, the questions being asked were ones that the assembled analysts and officials could not answer satisfactorily. How had Iran achieved jamming power levels that so significantly exceeded assessed capability? What was the actual size of the Iranian electronic warfare infrastructure that had not been visible to American collection? Why had the cyber intrusions that had been detected and attributed not been recognized as offensive pre-positioning rather than purely intelligence collection? What other Iranian capabilities across what other domains were being similarly and systematically underestimated? These questions did not have comfortable answers. In several cases, they did not have any confident answers at all. And the inability to provide those answers was itself a crisis, distinct from but compounding the immediate operational crisis unfolding in the theater. Because it meant that not only was the current situation less understood than it needed to be, it meant that every future assessment of Iranian capability in every domain would now carry an uncertainty discount that fundamentally complicated American decision-making going forward. If the intelligence community had been this wrong about Iranian counter-space capability, a domain it had been specifically watching and assessing for years, how confident could anyone be in assessments of Iranian capability in other domains? That question had no reassuring answer. The military dimension of Washington's shock went beyond the intelligence failure, because the Iranian jamming operation didn't just affect Israeli satellite services. American forces in the region depend on many of the same satellite constellations that Israel depends on, and several of those constellations are shared American-Israeli assets operating under bilateral agreements that give both militaries access to the same infrastructure. The physical reality of how jamming works means that American terminals operating in the same geographic area, American aircraft in the Eastern Mediterranean, American naval vessels in the Gulf region, experienced the same degraded signal environment that was crippling Israeli operations. American aircraft and ships found their satellite communication and navigation services degraded in ways that ranged from operationally inconvenient to tactically constraining depending on the specific system and the specific location. This was not the primary target of the Iranian operation. Israeli satellite access was the primary target. American degradation was a secondary effect, almost a byproduct, of an operation that was aimed somewhere else. And that secondary effect, that byproduct, was itself enough to produce measurable degradation in American military capability in the theater. The implication of that fact was not lost on anyone in the room during the NSC emergency session. If Iran could produce this level of satellite disruption for American forces as a secondary effect of an operation primarily targeted against Israel, what could a primary Iranian effort, an operation specifically designed and optimized from the beginning to target American satellite architecture rather than Israeli, actually achieve? That question sat in the room like a weight that nobody wanted to pick up and examine too closely. But it had to be examined, because the answer, whatever it was, would reshape American military planning for the region and potentially far beyond it. The classified programs that the United States has invested in to make its satellite infrastructure more resilient against exactly this kind of attack are real. They represent genuine engineering achievement and genuine capability improvement. Hardened uplink and downlink systems, frequency hopping communication protocols designed to defeat jamming, redundant constellation architectures with crosslinks that allow satellites to route around degraded ground stations, cyber defenses specifically designed to detect and neutralize the kind of intrusion and data corruption campaign that Iran just executed against Israeli infrastructure. These investments are real. The capability they represent is real. But the events of last night had demonstrated something that those investments had not yet fully accounted for. Iranian counter-space capability had progressed faster, further, and more comprehensively than the resilience investments had been designed to address. The margin of American advantage in the space domain, the margin that underpins American military superiority across every other domain of warfare, was narrower than Washington had believed going into last night. Narrower than the assessment said it was. Narrower than the planning assumptions embedded in American military doctrine assumed it to be. And discovering that a margin is narrower than you believed, not in a planning exercise, not in a simulation, not in a classified red team exercise, but in actual operational conditions against an actual adversary in an actual conflict, that is a discovery that changes things. Fundamentally, durably, in ways that cannot simply be walked back to the previous assumption once the immediate crisis has passed. What Iran accomplished last night must be understood not only as a tactical success against Israeli air capability, but as a strategic achievement in the space domain. A domain that has been almost exclusively controlled by Western powers and their allies since the very beginning of the space age. A domain that has become increasingly central to modern military operations as every advanced military force on Earth has built its doctrine, its planning, and its operational concepts around satellite-enabled capabilities. And a domain that, as of last night, is no longer the exclusive preserve of those Western powers and their allies. Space has been called the ultimate high ground, and the description is accurate in ways that go far beyond the metaphor. The military power that controls the space domain, or more precisely, that can use space freely while meaningfully denying its use to adversaries, holds decisive advantages in intelligence, communication, navigation, and targeting that cascade through every other domain of military operations. See further than your adversary, and you can strike before he knows you are coming. Communicate faster and more securely than your adversary, and you can coordinate complex operations across vast distances with a speed and precision he cannot match. Navigate with greater precision than your adversary, and your weapons hit exactly where you intend them to hit, while his fall short or wide. Target more accurately than your adversary, and you can destroy what matters while he destroys what doesn't. Every one of these advantages flows from space. Every one of them has been a foundational pillar of Western military superiority since the end of the Cold War. American GPS provides the navigation precision that makes precision-guided munitions possible, that transforms a dumb bomb into a weapon that can thread itself through a specific window of a specific building on a specific street in a city of millions. American communication satellites provide the bandwidth that modern networked military operations require. The bandwidth that allows a commander in a hardened facility thousands of miles from the battlefield to direct operations in real time with full situational awareness. American reconnaissance satellites provide the real-time intelligence that enables the kind of rapid, responsive strike operations that have characterized every American military campaign of the past 3 decades. This is the foundation. This is what Iran targeted. This is what Iran demonstrated the ability to meaningfully contest. And here is what makes Iran's achievement strategically significant in a way that extends far beyond the immediate military situation in the Middle East. Iran did not contest Western space advantage by doing what most Western analysts assumed a challenger would have to do, by launching kinetic anti-satellite weapons that physically destroy orbiting assets, by shooting satellites out of the sky, by creating debris fields that threaten the entire orbital environment. That approach, the direct ascent anti-satellite missile approach, carries enormous escalatory implications. Destroying an American or Israeli satellite with a kinetic weapon is an act of war in the most unambiguous sense. It produces immediate, visible, attributable destruction of sovereign assets. It demands a response. It crosses lines that have been understood as inviolable in the space domain since the beginning of the space age. Iran chose a different path. A combination of electronic, cyber, and directed energy methods that achieve the same operational effect, degrading or eliminating the adversary's ability to use space-based capabilities without the escalatory implications of kinetic attack. Jamming is reversible. Cyber intrusion can be denied or attributed ambiguously. Directed energy dazzling leaves no debris, no destroyed hardware, no smoking wreckage that demands an immediate and proportional response. The effect is the same. The escalatory profile is fundamentally different. This is not just tactically clever. It is strategically sophisticated in a way that demonstrates a deep understanding of how to achieve military objectives while managing escalation risk, an understanding that Western analysts had not adequately credited Iran with possessing. Developing the capability Iran demonstrated last night required investments across multiple technical domains over an extended period of time. Investments in high-power radio frequency systems capable of generating the jamming power levels that overwhelmed Israeli satellite communications. Investments in cyber intrusion tools and, critically, in the intelligence required to apply those tools against the specific target architectures of Israeli satellite ground segment infrastructure. Investments in directed energy systems capable of engaging satellites at operational altitudes with sufficient power and precision to achieve the dazzling or damage effects observed last night. These are not off-the-shelf capabilities. They cannot be purchased from a catalog. They cannot be imported from a friendly nation. They represent genuine, hard-won scientific and engineering achievement that was accomplished under the constraints of a comprehensive international sanctions regime specifically designed to limit Iranian access to the dual-use technology that advanced military systems require. And here's the strategic paradox that Western policymakers are now being forced to confront. A paradox that was always present in the logic of the sanctions strategy, but that last night's events have made impossible to continue ignoring. The intent of the sanctions regime applied to Iran over decades was clear and straightforward. Prevent Iran from accessing the technology required to develop advanced military capabilities, slow Iranian military development, increase its cost, force trade-offs that would leave Iran unable to field the kind of sophisticated military systems that would allow it to effectively challenge Western and Israeli military superiority in the region. The effect in the military domain has been the precise opposite of the intent. Sanctions can slow capability development. That is true. They can increase its cost significantly. They can force indigenous development in areas where imported components would otherwise have been used, creating inefficiencies and extending timelines. But they cannot prevent a nation with adequate human capital, institutional commitment, and strategic patience from eventually developing the capabilities it has identified as essential to its national security. What the sanctions regime actually did in the military domain was force Iran to develop its most critical military capabilities entirely indigenously, to build the scientific and engineering knowledge base required to design, develop, manufacture, and sustain advanced military systems without access to foreign components, foreign expertise, or foreign supply chains, and enforcing that indigenous development and closing off the shortcut of simply purchasing or importing advanced military technology. The sanctions inadvertently produced something more dangerous than what they were designed to prevent. Iranian military systems built entirely on indigenous engineering knowledge are not dependent on foreign supply chains that can be cut off by additional sanctions. They are not built around foreign components that can be embargoed. They cannot be degraded by the same external pressure that was supposed to prevent their development. The engineers who designed the jamming systems that went dark last night, the physicists who built the directed energy weapons that dazzled Israeli reconnaissance satellites, the cyber specialists who spent months establishing persistent access to Israeli satellite ground segment infrastructure were educated in Iranian universities, trained in Iranian research institutions. They spent their careers solving problems that their country's security required them to solve. And in solving those problems, under the pressure of sanctions, under the constraint of limited resources, under the urgency of existential stakes, they developed a depth of indigenous understanding and institutional knowledge that produces more resilient, more adaptable systems than imported technology would have provided. This is the paradox. The pressure that was designed to prevent Iranian military capability development instead created the conditions under which genuinely formidable Iranian military capability was developed. The national will that sustained this development effort over decades deserves direct acknowledgement, because understanding it is essential to understanding why Western strategies for managing Iranian military capability have consistently fallen short of their objectives. The Iranian national commitment to genuine strategic independence, including military independence, is not the product of government propaganda. It is not manufactured consent imposed by a government on an unwilling population. It is rooted in a historical experience of external pressure, external intervention, and attempted external coercion that stretches back generations. A historical experience that has produced a national consensus in Iran, cutting across the significant political divisions that exist within Iranian society, that genuine strategic independence is a non-negotiable national interest. This consensus is the product of lived historical experience, of a nation that has watched what happens to countries that accept dependence on external powers for their security. That has drawn its own conclusions from those observations, and that has decided collectively, durably, across political lines, that the costs of genuine self-reliance, however high those costs are lower than the costs of the alternative. When Iranian engineers worked through the technical challenges of developing satellite denial capability under sanctions, when they solved problems that required years of sustained effort and resources that had to be fought for within a constrained national budget, they were not simply doing their jobs in any ordinary professional sense. They were contributing to a national project whose importance they understood at a level that goes far beyond the professional. A project whose success or failure they understood could one day determine whether their country survived a military confrontation with adversaries possessing overwhelming conventional military superiority. That kind of stakes, existential stakes, changes the character of a development program in ways that are genuinely difficult to measure from outside. But they produce outcomes, real outcomes, operational outcomes. Last night was one of those outcomes. The strategic implications of Iran's demonstrated counter-space capability extend far beyond the Israeli-Iranian confrontation, far beyond the Middle East. Every nation that has built its military power on the foundation of satellite-enabled operations now knows, with operational evidence rather than theoretical assessment, that Iran possesses the ability to meaningfully degrade those operations in a regional context. Every American ally whose defense against regional adversaries depends substantially on American satellite-enabled military support, on American GPS, American communication satellites, American reconnaissance assets, now has to account for a possibility that was previously theoretical. The possibility that an adversary with Iranian-class counter-space capability can reduce the effectiveness of that American support in ways that matter operationally, in ways that change the outcome of engagements, in ways that could, under the right circumstances, be decisive. The deterrence implications of that possibility are significant, and they will require recalibration across multiple American alliance relationships simultaneously. The conversations happening right now in Seoul about what Korean defense against a North Korean adversary with access to Iranian-derived counter-space technology looks like. In Tokyo, about what Japanese defense planning assumptions need to look like in a world where satellite-dependent American military support cannot be assumed to be fully available in a crisis. In Warsaw, about what European defense architecture needs to account for if Russian access to Iranian counterspace technology allows Moscow to degrade NATO satellite services in a conflict scenario. In Riyadh, about what Gulf security guarantees are actually worth if the American military capability underpinning those guarantees can be meaningfully degraded by the kind of operation Iran just executed. These are not comfortable conversations. They are not conversations that have easy answers. They are conversations that were always going to happen eventually, but that last night's events have moved from eventual to immediate. When the satellite denial operation had run its intended course, when Iranian electronic warfare systems began their own assessment of the damage achieved, the operational picture that emerged was more consequential than even the most optimistic Iranian mission planner had projected before the operation began. The Israeli Air Force, the institution that has been the decisive instrument of Israeli military power for decades, the force that has struck targets across the Middle East with a freedom of action that no adversary has previously been able to meaningfully contest, had been reduced to an operationally degraded state during a critical operational window that changed the character of this conflict in ways that cannot be undone. And the window that mattered, the window during which Israeli air power would normally have been expected to dominate the airspace, suppress Iranian and Hezbollah military operations, and provide the decisive edge that Israel's overall defense concept depends on, was instead a window during which Israeli aircraft were grounded, partially operational, or executing missions with degraded precision that produced uncertain rather than decisive results. The consequence of that window was direct and immediate. Military operations that Iran and its partners needed to execute, the movement of materiel, the repositioning of forces, the activation of systems that would have been immediately identified and targeted if Israeli air power had been functioning at its normal level, occurred under conditions of Israeli air cover degradation that allowed them to proceed with a degree of freedom they would not otherwise have had. Iran did not just blind Israel's eyes, it used that blindness deliberately, precisely, effectively. For Israel, the morning assessment was a document of strategic reckoning unlike anything the Israeli defense establishment has had to confront in a generation. The Air Force that its entire defense model depends on had demonstrated a critical vulnerability, not a marginal vulnerability at the edges of its capability envelope, a structural vulnerability at the very core of the information architecture its operations are built upon. A vulnerability that Iran had identified years ago, had developed the capability to exploit over an extended period of patient, deliberate investment, and had executed against with a precision and comprehensiveness that left no room for dismissing what happened as a one-time event and lucky confluence of circumstances, or a gap that can be closed with a software update and a revised operating procedure. The question confronting Israeli military and political leadership in the hours after dawn was not simply how to recover from what had happened the night before. It was a far harder, far more consequential question. How do you redesign a military architecture, an architecture that has been the foundation of national security for decades, an architecture that an entire generation of military planners has built their careers around, when that architecture has just been shown to rest on a foundation with a structural flaw? How do you rebuild confidence in your own forces, in your allies, in the adversaries who are watching and recalculating, in a military capability that has just demonstrated publicly, operationally, and undeniably that it can be meaningfully degraded by a capable adversary? These are not technical questions with technical answers. They are strategic questions of the most serious and most difficult kind. Questions that will shape Israeli defense policy, Israeli alliance relationships, and Israeli strategic posture for years, possibly decades, to come. For the United States, the morning required something that intelligence communities find genuinely difficult to do under the best of circumstances and nearly impossible to do under the pressure of an ongoing crisis. It required the revision, the fundamental, comprehensive revision of every classified assessment that had characterized Iranian counterspace capability as developmental, as not yet operationally significant, as years away from the threshold required for effective employment against sophisticated adversaries. Not just revision of the conclusions, revision of the analytical frameworks through which American intelligence had been understanding and assessing Iranian military capability. Because the consistent pattern of underestimating Iranian capability, the pattern that last night's events had exposed with brutal clarity, did not suggest a domain-specific analytical error. It suggested a systemic analytical problem. A problem with the assumptions, the methodologies, and the institutional biases embedded in how American intelligence approaches the assessment of adversary military capability more broadly. If those frameworks produce systematically wrong assessments of Iranian counterspace capability, a domain that American intelligence had been specifically focused on and specifically resourced to assess, what confidence was warranted in assessments produced by the same frameworks about Iranian capability in other domains? That question demanded an answer. And the answer, whatever it turned out to be, was going to be uncomfortable because the implications extended beyond Iran, beyond the Middle East, to every adversary capability assessment that American military planning and American alliance commitments rest upon. For the regional order, the morning after marked the consolidation and acceleration of a shift that had been building for years beneath the surface of events, but that last night's operation had brought dramatically and irreversibly into the open. A Middle East in which Israeli air superiority could be assumed, in which the Israeli Air Force provided a deterrence umbrella whose shadow shaped the strategic calculations of every regional actor, friend, and adversary alike, and was transitioning into something different, into a Middle East in which that assumption could no longer be made with the confidence that had previously justified the strategic calculations built upon it. The actors who had been calibrating their behavior based on the old assumption, who had been making decisions about what they could and could not do, what risks they could and could not take, what ambitions they could and could not pursue, were now conducting urgent recalculations. And recalculations of that magnitude by that many actors simultaneously in a region already under the pressure of active conflict produce consequences that compound and cascade in ways that are genuinely difficult to predict and genuinely difficult to manage. The world that the sun rose on after the night Iran blinded Israel's satellites is a world in which several things are now permanently true that were not operationally demonstrated to be true before. The space domain is genuinely contested in a regional context, not just theoretically, not just in classified assessments, but operationally, demonstrably, with results that speak for themselves. Satellite-dependent military operations, the kind of operations that define modern Western-style warfare that have underpinned Western military dominance for 3 decades, face a meaningful adversary capability that can degrade them in ways that matter. The technology gap that has underpinned Israeli and American military dominance in the Middle East has been visibly, publicly, operationally narrowed in ways that cannot be walked back by issuing a new assessment or updating a doctrine document. These are facts now, operational facts. Facts established not in a simulation or a think tank paper or a classified red team exercise, but in actual combat conditions against actual forces with actual consequences. Facts of that kind do not unestablish themselves. They become the new baseline from which all future planning, all future assessment, and all future strategic thinking must proceed. The Fatah 3 that destroyed Arrow 3 batteries made headlines around the world. Dramatic, visible, undeniable. But the satellite denial operation that blinded the F-35 and collapsed Israeli Air Force operations for a critical operational window may ultimately prove to be the more consequential achievement of this conflict, because it did not attack the hardware of Israeli military power. It attacked the information foundation that the hardware depends on to be effective. And that distinction matters enormously. You can rebuild a missile battery. The engineering is understood, the components exist. The timeline is constrained by manufacturing capacity and budget, not by fundamental technical uncertainty. A destroyed Arrow 3 battery is a setback measured in months. Rebuilding confidence in a military architecture that has just demonstrated a structural vulnerability against a capable, determined, and clearly well-informed adversary is a fundamentally different undertaking. It requires not just replacing destroyed hardware, but rethinking the foundational assumptions on which the architecture was built. Identifying vulnerabilities that were not previously recognized as vulnerabilities. Developing new operating concepts for environments that the old concepts did not adequately account for. Building new redundancies into systems that were designed with redundancies that have now been shown to be insufficient. And doing all of that while the adversary that just demonstrated it understands your architecture, deeply continues to watch, continues to learn, and continues to develop its capability. That is not a setback measured in months. That is a challenge measured in years, possibly in a generation. The story of this conflict is not over. It is entering a phase whose character and ultimate outcome remain genuinely uncertain in ways that make confident prediction impossible. What is certain is that the phase being entered is different in kind from what came before. More complex because the capability environment has changed in ways that require new thinking from every actor in the theater. More contested because the assumption of Israeli and American dominance that had previously simplified the strategic calculus for every regional actor can no longer be made with the confidence that simplification requires, and more consequential for the regional order, for the global balance of military power, and for the strategic relationships and security guarantees that the international system has organized itself around than any previous chapter of this confrontation. The decisions being made right now in Jerusalem, in Washington, in Tehran, in Moscow, in Beijing, in every capital where serious people are watching these events and drawing their own conclusions, will shape the trajectory of this conflict and the regional order it is reshaping for years to come. What happened last night did not end anything. It began something whose full implications for the Middle East, for American military power, for the global strategic order, we are only beginning to understand. If this analysis gave you a perspective on these events that you could not find anywhere else, share it, hit like, subscribe, and leave your assessment in the comments below. Stay sharp, stay informed.